So very warm welcome once again to you wherever you are joining us from today for an important discussion and webinar titled COVID-19 Vaccine and What to Know If You Are Immunocompromised. My name is Shilpa Venkatachalam and I am honored to be your facilitator for this evening's discussion. I am the Associate Director of Patient-Centered Research at the Global Healthy Living Foundation and also the co-principal investigator on Arthritis Power, which is our research registry and tracking app for people living with different types of rheumatic and musculoskeletal diseases. Our mission at the Global Healthy Living Foundation is to improve the lives of people with chronic disease through better access to care, education, support, advocacy, and patient-centered research. And so in line with this mission, we've been conducting webinars like this one for over 2 years now, bringing research and facilitating dialogue on important topics in healthcare. I know we are all very eager to dive right in, so I'll take a few brief moments just to very quickly frame our discussion today, go through some housekeeping rules, and then introduce to you our distinguished speaker. This month, last year, March 2020, the world as we knew it changed as a new virus ravaged countries across the globe. On March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared the outbreak of COVID-19 a pandemic. 1 year on, glimmers of hope for a healthier year have emerged with the breakthrough in vaccine development and the subsequent availability of vaccines under an emergency use authorization. But questions and concerns remain, especially for those of us who live with a chronic condition or who are immunocompromised. To help answer some of these questions, I am delighted to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Jeffrey Curtis. Dr. Curtis is a professor of medicine, Division of Clinical Immunology and Rheumatology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He is also co-principal investigator on Arthritis Power. More recently, he chaired the American College of Rheumatology COVID-19 Vaccine Clinical Guidance Task Force. It is in fact under his leadership that guidance was developed by a multidisciplinary panel of rheumatologists, infectious disease specialists, and public health experts, mainly to provide direction to physicians treating rheumatology patients on how to best use COVID-19 vaccines. It is really an honor to be joined by him today, and we thank him for his time. Lastly, allow me a few more brief minutes to go through some very quick housekeeping rules before I can hand it over to Dr. Curtis. Please note that all audience members will be placed on mute. This is mainly to help ensure that we can get a good quality recording for the webinar, so people who did not have a chance to attend live can access it later on. The webinar will be posted on the Creaky Joints website. In an effort to provide greater accessibility, the recorded webinar will have closed captions. As always, this webinar is for all of us, and we encourage your questions. Please send them to us through the question box. You should see a little gray box in the corner of your screen, and you can send us your questions at any time during this webinar. Your questions also help us inform future content that we develop at Creaky Joints. I might take this opportunity here to mention that, as you can imagine, we have received a very high volume of questions, and while we want to try and answer them all for you today, it is likely that we might not be able to answer every single question, and for that, we apologize in advance. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Curtis, who will present for about 35 to 40 minutes and will then field questions. Dr. Curtis?
So as Shilpa said, we're going to talk about the American College of Rheumatology, or the ACR's COVID-19 vaccine clinical guidance, which I have and had the privilege of leading. This is an ongoing task force. I'm going to walk you through some of the highlights. This is publicly available. There's nothing secret about this. In fact, there's been a full manuscript that's just been published and is available as an early access at Arthritis and Rheumatology, and I'm sure that GHLF and Arthritis Power will post links to that as well. We'll then walk through a handful of what might be considered patient myths that we'll talk through some of the specifics. And then, as Shilpa had already mentioned, the Global Healthy Living Foundation has received dozens, if not close to hundreds of questions that I'll do my very best to address. And if there's time remaining, we may be able to take some ad hoc questions as well. We'll just kind of see how it goes. Next slide. So as mentioned, the product of the ACR's Clinical Guidance Task Force is really the subject of discussion. And even in the title of this presentation, you had to make a decision when you chose to attend about whether you're immunocompromised. And because that might not be a familiar term to everyone, and frankly, there may be a fair amount of ambiguity about it, I thought it would be helpful just to say, well, what is that? And, does this term apply to you? So broadly speaking, immunocompromised or immune compromised, same thing, just means that your immune system may not be able to fight off infections as well as it otherwise could. And we've given a handful of reasons on this slide, and I'm not going to read through all of it. People can read their own selves, but just to touch on some of the highlights. Most people with certain chronic conditions, HIV, AIDS, almost by definition, are going to be considered immune compromised. Maybe more salient to most on this call, a number of conditions, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. There's a number of inflammatory and autoimmune conditions that cause immune compromised states. This is not unique to autoimmune diseases. There's a number of other conditions that aren't even infection related. So diabetes, severe kidney disease, those all can weaken the immune system and make it more difficult for the immune system to fight off infections. For the many people I suspect on this call that are on medications that affect the immune system, in fact, this is why your doctor or healthcare provider uses those, because if you're not using a medication that affects the immune system to treat an immune system problem, then you're not really treating the underlying disease. You may be helping symptoms, but you're not actually treating the base problem if you're not using a immune affecting medication to treat an immune condition. That said, both the disease itself as well as many of the treatments used to treat autoimmune and inflammatory conditions will weaken the immune system. But again, it's kind of a necessity because that's how you treat those conditions appropriately. There are other conditions that are associated with immune compromised states. So organ transplant. In fact, transplant patients sometimes receive some of the same medications that people with, say, lupus or psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis might be using. Transplant patients tend to be more immunocompromised, and that's another point I want to make. Being immune compromised is not all one thing. So, and sometimes that might be a misunderstanding in that, if people look at this list and say, wait, if I have rheumatoid arthritis, does that mean I have something like AIDS or I'm a transplant patient? No. Immune compromising conditions or medications is not one thing. It, in fact, is a spectrum of varying influences on the immune system. So just because you might have something on this list doesn't mean that you have an immune system that is weakened, like, say, if someone had HIV disease or had received an organ transplant. And for that reason, we included the final two bullets. As people age, if they get into their 70s or 80s, your immune system, just as you age, is not quite as effective. And there are conditions like shingles that are increasingly common with age, and that's why your immune system, which basically acts as the sentry or the guard to police against certain kinds of infections or reactivating, it just is less effective as you age. And so for that reason, people's immune system is weakened as they get into the 7th, 8th decades of life. And then finally, smoking, as well as a number of other environmental exposures, can weaken the immune system. So if any of these things or things like them is a condition or a medication that you have, then the next several minutes are probably going to apply to you. But don't take it to think that just because you have one of the health conditions we're talking about today, that necessarily means that you have a weakened immune system on par with someone with HIV disease or who's gotten a kidney or liver transplant or something like that. Next slide. So in terms of what it is that we're going to talk about and why is this just more than somebody's opinion. So the American College of Rheumatology periodically puts out guidelines or guidance statements, they do this for a number of diseases. Rheumatoid arthritis was among the first, juvenile arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, etc. There's many of these, but more recently, they've convened some guideline task forces to review lots of literature and evidence about what vaccines do and how much they help and what some of the timing considerations might be for rheumatology patients. So the work I'm getting ready to talk to you about actually falls under one of those guidelines committees. It's actually called a guidance statement, and that's in part because this was done with relatively little evidence in that there's no direct evidence from people with rheumatic conditions, lupus, rheumatoid, etc., getting COVID vaccination. So we don't have any studies where dozens and hundreds of people are getting vaccinated against COVID and we know what happens. That data, of course, is accruing, but it's extrapolated evidence. And so this literature search and this evidence review and the rightmost symbol here, what that was is we reviewed all the literature about what's known for vaccination for flu and pneumonia and shingles and other kinds of vaccines in rheumatology patients, and then we're extrapolating that and the immunologic principles from those studies to what we think probably will happen and might be relevant for COVID vaccination, but we lack direct evidence. And so as a consequence of not having any direct evidence, and by that I mean what happens when rheumatology patients get the COVID vaccine, that's the direct evidence I'm saying that we are lacking, then all of these recommendations are considered conditional. And what that word means in ACR speak is that the guidance I'm getting ready to share with you is what is considered probably prudent for a lot of patients under most conditions. But it's not prescriptive and it's not proscriptive. This is not exactly what everybody should do, and it's definitely not what people shouldn't be doing. Like, this is a starting place to talk with your healthcare provider and have a discussion about what's right for you. If there was best evidence, great, then we would summarize that, and hopefully just about everybody would do that. But we don't have best evidence. We have what people think is probably the right thing to do, but that's why this is very rapidly evolving. And as new evidence is acquired, as we have more vaccine candidates and vaccines available, and we have more data on the one we have, this guidance and these statements I'm getting ready to share with you will almost certainly evolve. And in fact, we're currently on version 2 of these guidance statements that we hope to have done by the next 2 to 3 weeks or so. Next slide. So these are then the guidance statements. You can look these up online. These are on the ACR's website. Again, they're in the public domain. I'm not going to read every single one. Again, people can read and can reflect on them in their leisure. I'm going to highlight just a couple of those that are in yellow and bolded here so people kind of understand some of the context. So bullet number 2 and 3 are a bit related. Bullet 2 basically says that patients with autoimmune and inflammatory rheumatic disease, so again, that might be code for immune-compromising conditions or treatments. So based upon the best evidence we have now, it appears that patients with those conditions are at higher risk for hospitalized and serious COVID and worse outcomes. So if patients with immune-compromising conditions and with autoimmune diseases are at higher risk to both get hospitalized COVID and to do worse, then that's where the yellow statement comes in. That based upon that higher risk, that autoimmune and inflammatory patients, and I'm just going to refer to that as autoimmune here going out since that's a mouthful, should be prioritized for vaccination before the non-prioritized general population of the same age and sex. And what that really is that is intended to help provide advocacy to rheumatology patients across the country, if not across the globe, that if any public health authority, if any vaccine distribution mechanism cares about risk in distributing vaccine, some do, some don't, but if anybody in your community or region actually cares to vaccinate higher risk people, the intent of this statement was to say, look, rheumatology patients on immune compromising medications, they're at higher risk. They should be prioritized so that if somebody wants to get vaccinated, here is a guidance statement that actually would help provide some justification to help them get vaccinated perhaps sooner than someone who is healthy of the same age and sex. We realize that in some regions, no one will care about this or pay attention, and it's solely based on age. That's unfortunate, but obviously without a national vaccine rollout program, it's been rather hit or miss across the United States. In other places, they actually might care to vaccinate higher risk people, but this is in part related to that advocacy goal. I know that GHLF certainly does a lot in terms of advocacy efforts, and so to the extent that people care about risk, that's the purpose of this. The next bolded statement, 2 rows down, the expected response to vaccination for many autoimmune patients on systemic immune compromising or immunomodulatory, so that just means a medicine that modulates the immune system, is likely to be blunted in magnitude and duration compared to the general population. So what does that mean? Practically, it means that the vaccine against COVID may not work as well, and it may not last as long. I've had some of my own patients exceedingly alarmed by that. If it's not going to work as well, maybe I shouldn't get it. I quickly try to dispel that notion by providing a bit of a quantitative example. So for instance, let's say that a vaccine was 90 or 95% effective, like some of those that we have for trials for. And that is how effective, both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines were in their large, many tens of thousands of people that were studied. If that same vaccine in somebody, say, who has lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, let's say hypothetically it was only 70% effective. 70% effective is definitely less than 95% effective. On the other hand, 70% effective is pretty good. Like that's better than flu vaccination, even in the very best of years. So the point is that even if a vaccine may not work as well, a good response, which is what we certainly hope it would be for a patient with an autoimmune disease, is definitely better than no response if somebody, for whatever reason, chose not to be vaccinated. I'd also point out that having a vaccine's response not be quite as good if you have an autoimmune condition, that's not unique to COVID. We actually see that with just about all vaccines. So vaccine response with most autoimmune patients on most immune-affecting therapies just isn't quite as good. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It certainly doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. It just means that it's not quite as good, and that we have to think a little bit more cautiously about, when to vaccinate, maybe when to revaccinate or give a booster. Maybe we should be vaccinating younger people, that sort of thing. So it doesn't mean that even if you don't get the maximal responses, if you had no medical conditions and were on no treatments, that you shouldn't do it. It just means it might not be quite as good. And maybe if one day we have a booster, perhaps somebody might need it a little bit more often than a healthy person of their same age and sex. And then the last one that I want to speak to is the final one in yellow. A theoretical risk exists for autoimmune flare or disease worsening following vaccination. I can tell you that the language here was very hotly contested. Is there a risk for flare? Yes. Is it possible your disease gets worse? It is possible. We, of course, have no direct data suggesting that that's the case. I can give you a few examples from other large published studies with other vaccines that might help maybe dispel some of your fears. For example, after influenza vaccination, the risk for flare was about 5% in a large rheumatoid arthritis population. So that wasn't a whole lot different according to what treatments that people were on. But, if the expected response after some other vaccine was to have about a 5% risk for flare, in some of the studies we have, because flare honestly hasn't been studied all that frequently, we don't actually know what the background rate of flare would have been in that same study. But even if it was as bad as high as 5%, if that was the worst case scenario, and it might be, that's not a terribly high risk that you have a disease flare compared to the very bad things that COVID can cause. But it is a potential concern, and this is why we're recommending, doctors and healthcare providers talk to their patients and vice versa about, what might be best for them, and to discuss what some of these issues are. There's certain circumstances where maybe that's not an acceptable risk, and again, you should talk through with your own healthcare provider. Next slide. So then a few other statements. So maybe the most important one, which is not in yellow, is at the very top. Patients with rheumatic and musculoskeletal diseases, that's this RMD abbreviation, and then autoimmune and inflammatory patients should receive vaccination, consistent with the age restriction of the emergency use authorization. So basically, to paraphrase that very first statement, according to the ACR and its guidance task force, you should get vaccinated if you have a rheumatology condition. Right now, that age restriction is age 16 and up for the general population. We actually ran by the Pediatric Rheumatology Task Force, who said, because we don't have any direct evidence, we don't have trials in children with data yet, trials are being recruited down to age 12, but we don't have any of that data yet, then we think we're going to hold off on making any statements because it would just be very, very opinion-based, and we're not even sure that kids younger than age 16 can get vaccinated in most places in the U.S. anyway, so we're going to hold off. Obviously, that can change. The next statement that's in yellow, rheumatic disease patients who don't have an autoimmune condition, but that are on some immunomodulatory or immune-affecting therapy should get vaccinated according to all these statements. So if, for your example, you are on, I don't know, methotrexate, which is a drug that we commonly use for rheumatoid and sometimes for lupus and a variety of other things, psoriasis, etc. If you're on methotrexate for some other reason that isn't an autoimmune disease, let's say you're on it for gout or erosive osteoarthritis. So those aren't autoimmune conditions, but we sometimes use those medicines off-label, meaning they're not FDA approved, but they still seem to help some patients. Then this guideline applies to you. The second highlighted row on row 3, based upon the data for the mRNA COVID vaccines available in the U.S., and again, there's 2, there's no preference for one over another, and you should just get whichever is available to you. You might say, wait, aren't there 3 vaccines available in the U.S.? Yes, and that's why this guidance statement is currently undergoing review. I suspect, and if I were to guess, I would have very high expectations that we'll just remove the word mRNA so that this will just read, based upon the data for the 3 vaccines available, there's no preference, meaning get whatever is available to you, and the best vaccine is the one that you can get your hands on the most quickly. There are some differences between them. We'll get into maybe a few of the differences or perceived differences in the next few minutes, but whatever you have access to, you should just go get that, and there's not a strong and compelling reason why you should prefer one over another. Most people, myself included, and I've been vaccinated, don't have a choice anyway, so get the one that's accessible to you. The third statement in yellow, about halfway down on the slide, so healthcare providers should not routinely order any lab testing, and I've given some examples of what kind of follow-up lab testing after vaccination that you might order to assess immunity post-vaccination. I can tell you that this was controversial when it was written and came out, and we've gotten a myriad of patient questions about this. You might be one of those people whose healthcare provider ordered some lab-based testing. It's not necessarily a bad idea, and I think over time, once we have more data, this is likely to be one of the statements that gets modified. However, at this moment in time, the recommendation to routinely order lab testing. Routinely means like if 1,000 of a doctor's patients are getting vaccinated against COVID, that he or she would likely order it for pretty much all 1,000. That's what we mean by routinely, like across your whole practice. Does that mean that it was wrong if your healthcare provider ordered lab testing for you in particular? No, that's definitely not what this is saying. There's 2 reasons why this guidance statement was made and reads as it does. The first is that a lot of people were getting the wrong thing tested. If you're getting the lab test for antibodies for COVID after vaccination, you might be getting the wrong test. It depends upon what the antibody is measuring. If the antibody is measuring the thing that your immune system gets exposed to, the spike protein, that's kind of the jacket of the virus. So the vaccine essentially helps your immune system recognize the jacket, then great, that's the thing that you should be measuring. On the other hand, there's lots of other components of the virus that your body could make antibodies to. They're not necessarily protective, but a lab could measure them. If you think of this as an outfit, they're the pants of the virus. And, the pants may not be very important to make a vaccine, but there's something you can test for after someone had natural COVID infection. So if you're testing for the wrong antibodies, they'll turn negative and frankly panic people for no good reason. So a lot of people were actually having the wrong test ordered, or it was measuring the wrong thing. And in part, that is based upon what we had available and what made sense if you're trying to detect COVID infection, but that doesn't really make sense anymore to to measure antibodies against a different part of the virus, the nucleocapsid. They're the pants in my example, because that's not what the vaccine does. And so if you measure that, of course, it's going to be negative if you've never had infection. So the point is that right now, there's no routine testing that's recommended, but that's likely to change. And then finally, the very last statement that's highlighted, while vaccination would occur ideally in the setting of well-controlled autoimmune disease, unless you have a life-threatening illness, like you are sick in the hospital in the intensive care unit, you should just go get vaccinated as soon as possible. And you might say, well, yeah, haven't you already said this? In fact, here's the subtlety. There might be certain circumstances. You're on some treatments, your disease is doing terrible, you're in the middle of a flare, where somebody says, well, maybe the vaccine could work a little bit better if you were on less prednisone and your disease was under better control. We don't know that with certainty, but it might be the case. On the other hand, what that message then would tell a patient is, you need to wait. You need to wait until this or that changes. Well, doctors can't predict the future very well. And so for that reason, telling people to wait until X, Y, or Z happens and not get vaccinated might not actually be very prudent. And the task force generally, if we made errors, it was likely to encourage people to be vaccinated sooner and not to wait, because the risks of waiting mean you're not at all protected. And some protection, even if you give the vaccine under less than ideal conditions, is better than no protection if somebody chooses not to get vaccinated because they're delaying for the so-called perfect time. That perfect time might never actually come. Next slide. So then this is a complicated table, and I'll walk you through the highlights, but I'll walk you through the medicines because we have the generic names here. So in the first column are all of the rheumatology treatments that we would routinely give, and then what we should do about either holding those treatments or timing vaccination in relation to those treatments. So the timing is, when should I get vaccinated if I'm on this treatment? And then conversely, should I do something to the treatment if I'm about to get vaccinated? Those are not the same thing. They're kind of related, but they're clearly not synonymous. So for the first row that has a bunch of things on it, so there was a recommendation to make no modifications to the medicine or to the timing of vaccination. So just to read out the medicines, and again, I'm going to substitute the brand and the generic names as I read them, just because sometimes people know brand names better than generic. So hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil, apremilast or Otezla, glucocorticoids like prednisone at a dose of less than 20 milligrams a day. If you're on any of those, the recommendation is just go get vaccinated, and you don't need to modify or hold or change or any of your treatments. In that second big row, there's sulfasalazine, leflunomide, mycophenolate, which is Celsep, azathioprine, which is Imuran, cyclophosphamide, which is Cytoxan, the TNF inhibitors, that's TNFI, so that would be Enbrel and Humira, that would be Simponi, and that would be Cimzia. So those are the TNF inhibitors, and for all of those therapies, you would make no modifications to the vaccine therapy or the timing of the vaccine. The TNF therapies also include Remicade, and then there's some medicines that are very similar, like Remicade, or infliximab, Inflectra, Remsima. If you're not from the U.S., those might be called a couple different things depending on your own country. But again, it's infliximab, which is the TNF inhibitor. The interleukin-6 drugs, so that's Kevzara or Siroliumab, and Actemra or Tocilizumab. IL-1, which would be canakinumab or Ilaris, or Kineret, which is anakinra. So the IL-17 drugs, so that would include Taltz, that would include Cosentyx. The IL-12/23 biologics, so that would include Stelara. The IL-23, of which there is a couple, so there's Skyrizi and there's Tremfya, belimumab or Benlysta. So I apologize for all the alphabet soup and the long names here, but again, we wanted to make sure that people could pick out their medicine. So for the vast majority and everything I've just named, there's no modification to either the medicine or the timing of the vaccine. The three exceptions are the three bottom rows. If you're on methotrexate, there's a recommendation to hold it a week after each vaccine dose, particularly for those who have well-controlled disease, because remember, I remembered that small extra risk flare that might be in the 5% or so range. So you should just go get the vaccine, but the recommendation is hold the next dose of methotrexate. For the Janus inhibitors, so baricitinib, which is Olumiant, tofacitinib, which is Xeljanz, and upadacitinib, that's Rinvoq, the recommendation is to hold those medicines for a week after each vaccine dose. And then finally, for abatacept, which is Orencia sub-Q, the recommendation is to hold for 1 week before and after just the first dose of the vaccine. So for a 2-dose series, like with the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, the second dose would not have any modifications to it. The modification would only exist with the first dose. Now, you might say, wait, I've already been vaccinated. I didn't do this. Like, is that terrible? It's probably okay. Again, we don't have direct evidence. Did it mean the vaccine was worthless? No. Did it mean that it might not have worked quite as well? That's maybe what it means. Again, we're not certain, but that was our best estimate based upon what we know for other vaccines. So it certainly doesn't mean that, it was useless or that you have to repeat the whole thing. It might not have worked as well. We just don't know yet, but that's why these recommendations exist. Next slide. So there's a few other therapies that may not apply to quite as many people that we'll go through just on this last slide. So if you'd advance it one, Shilpa. So Orencia IV, that's the first row. I'll let people read it. There's a timing consideration. Cyclophosphamide, Cytoxan, same thing. Rituximab is a little bit more complicated. That's usually given as 2 long infusions. They take much of the day for many people, separated by usually about 4 to 6 months apart. The recommendation is that you get vaccinated a month before you are next due for your rituximab. So if you're normally getting rituximab every 6 months, you would get your vaccine or start the series at about month 5 into your every 6-month series of infusions. Next slide. So then there's a handful of what might be myths or maybe misperceptions versus either fact or perhaps just sort of best evidence. And in some sense, this was compiled from both patients' experiences, thoughts, questions that we've had people write in or pre-submit. Next slide. So we wanted to walk through a few of these things because I hear this with some of my patients. The first is that, as I already touched on, there's 3 vaccines that are available. They're not FDA approved, and I've actually seen this being misquoted by the press, etc. They're technically not licensed. They're available under an emergency use authorization or an EUA. There's a series of steps that's required to go get official FDA approval. The vaccines we currently have in the U.S. have not gone through all of those steps. They're available under this EUA, but they're technically not FDA approved. Next slide. So a handful of myths, and we'll come back to the FDA approved thing. So the first is the sentiment might be, if I'm immunocompromised, I shouldn't take the vaccine. So in the right panel, as we've already discussed, patients with autoimmune and inflammatory disease really appear based upon multiple studies done throughout large populations, not just, small little investigations. It looks like people with rheumatoid or lupus or vasculitis or other inflammatory conditions have a higher risk for hospitalized COVID and worse outcomes compared to the general population, which is why it's so important to get the vaccine, because if that was you, you're at higher risk. Now, is that risk higher than an 80-year-old in a nursing home? No. But is it higher risk than somebody, your age who's on no medicines? Yeah, it is. And so that's why we want to do a lot to advocate for patients that might be at higher risk to get COVID and have worse outcomes with COVID, because that risk is elevated. Next slide. So on myth 2, so none of the available vaccines are safe for me because I'm immune compromised. So in fact, it's a little bit related to what we already talked about. The Center for Disease Control, which is the public health authority in our country, has said that people with weakened immune systems can get the vaccine, and in fact, particularly important. And in fact, I already walked you through the ACR guidance statement that says that you should get vaccinated. So not only is it not neutral, but there is a recommendation for you to get vaccinated. So in fact, that's not the case, and hopefully this guidance statement can dispel that. Next slide. And then the third variant of this same notion. So the COVID-19 vaccine won't protect me because I have an immune system condition. Again, we've spoken to this to some extent. Even if the vaccine doesn't work quite as well, that was my example of, it's only 70% effective versus 90 or 95% in the general population. 70%, if that's what it was, is pretty good, and it's certainly not as good as 95 probably, but it's better than none if somebody elected to forego vaccination. Next slide. So another one that I hear sometimes is, maybe the vaccine will make me sick with the virus. In fact, that is absolutely incorrect. So the vaccine cannot make you sick with the virus. It cannot give you COVID infection. None of these are live virus vaccines. People may have read in the news or through other sources. So some of them are distributed, or some of them are made with what's called an adenovirus or an adenoviral vector. There's certainly a few other vaccines outside of the U.S., the Sputnik 5 vaccine in Russia, there's a few in China. So adenovirus is essentially a delivery system, and the vaccines that we currently have available to us in the U.S. have a non-replicating delivery system. They're the FedEx truck that can deliver the package that you order from Amazon, but it's not a truck factory. It can't make more trucks of itself. It can only do the thing it's supposed to do. It's literally a delivery system. It's not able to make you ill and give you COVID. None of these are live virus vaccines. Probably, as you're aware, nobody with an immune compromising condition should get a live virus vaccine if you had any other option to get to have a different kind of vaccine. That's true most places in the world, certainly in the U.S., but none of these vaccines are live viruses against COVID, and I personally doubt that we would ever see a live COVID virus vaccine ever, or at least not anytime in the next several years. Next slide. So the myth that my disease will flare, and it's probably not entirely proper to call this a myth, simply because that is a real, albeit at least theoretical concern. Yeah, that might happen. So I already touched on this before, but I'd also point out, because sometimes people forget this, like people can get disease flares and new onset autoimmune conditions and manifestations after COVID itself. So I can give you examples of bona fide new onset rheumatoid arthritis, new onset vasculitis, a number of bad things after just getting COVID infection. So although this is a real thing, and this is important to talk to your healthcare provider in your circumstance about, if you get COVID, that definitely can trigger a number of autoimmune flares, manifestations, etc. So again, you have to balance the risks and the benefits, and sometimes people underemphasize the benefits of getting vaccinated, not realizing that COVID infection may not just be the infection, it can trigger other things about your disease or have new onset autoimmune manifestations, blood clots, and things like that. Next slide. So the next myth, immunocompromised people weren't included in clinical trials, so we don't know about safety for people like me. Well, again, mostly when you take a vaccine to approval, you're not going to study rheumatoid or lupus just because you want fairly healthy volunteers because they're easier to study and they are going to have a more alike response. That said, just because a group of people isn't included in a clinical trial doesn't mean that the vaccine is unsafe. And in fact, in part to address this very concern, HIV patients were eligible for the trials. And so it was explicitly studied in people with HIV disease as an immune compromising condition. Next slide. So the vaccines were made too quickly, and we don't know about how safe they are. So the technology, in response to technology used to develop them, isn't new. The clinical trials were done with the same thoroughness, and there were multiple advisory panels that carefully considered all the evidence. So they didn't short circuit any of the steps. Next slide. I'll show you why things were developed under more abbreviated conditions. So in the top of this slide, you'll see a set of panels. This is the traditional development stage to bring a new product, be it a vaccine or a medication, to market. So you do a bunch of animal studies and you do studies in test tubes, hoping that, whatever it is you're developing, in this case, a vaccine, works. You then take it through multiple different phases of clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3, and you'll see that in red and yellow and blue. Each of those steps typically takes a few years. Pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacturers typically spend millions and millions and millions of dollars during that phase. And every time a company moves from phase 1 to 2 to 3, they have to invest more and more money. The trials in phase 2 are always more expensive than phase 1, and 3 is more expensive than phase 2. So at any point in time, a pharmaceutical company can basically pull the plug and say, you know what, this just isn't panning out, or there's a safety problem. They can yank the whole thing and shut it down and say, we're done. And you can minimize your investment if you're business people that work for pharmaceutical or vaccine companies, and that protects you against financial loss. What you see, though, for SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development, that you didn't skip any. None of the phases were violated. We still have them all, but they overlap. And you would say, well, why don't we always do that? Doesn't that make sense? You might think that that makes sense as long as you weren't the one having to pay the bills to develop the new product or the new vaccine, because you've already spent the money once the study launches. So if, in fact, something is going to fail, you have no opportunity to basically halt the phase 3 study and never start it, because it's overlapping with the phase 2 study. So as I understand it, some of the vaccine developers had some financial underwriting by the U.S. government or other sponsors so that they would be protected against financial loss if they were working on a vaccine candidate that didn't pan out. So the business aspects are probably not very salient to you or to me or to any of us perhaps, but the point is all of the phases are here, all of the steps are here. It's just rather than do them in series, it was done in overlap, and that's why we have quicker vaccines. But it doesn't mean that steps were skipped or that somehow we've compromised safety. The other thing to get FDA licensure that typically companies have to do is they have to have multiple studies, not just a single study. But SARS-CoV-2 is obviously so important that a single study gets you emergency use authorization if it works as well as all the vaccines currently available in the U.S. have had. So this really addresses the question, maybe a bunch of steps were skipped, and you can see from this slide, and hopefully my explanation made it clear, that's not the case. Steps were not skipped in this whole process. Now, I'm also the first to point out, we don't have a lot of follow-up on people in any of these studies. Do we have 3 and 5 years of vaccine follow-up after vaccination? No, of course not. On the other hand, I can tell you as somebody who does vaccine research for a living, normally if you're going to see bad or odd things happen, you're going to mostly see it in the first 6 weeks and almost with complete certainty by 6 months. Is that a guarantee that, something long-term might surface and come to light? No, of course not. But I can tell you that for most vaccines and in most vaccine studies, whatever the issues are likely going to be realized, if there are any, within 6 months. And we certainly are at that point for the vaccines that we have available, especially the mRNA vaccines. So although we don't know what we don't know, I can tell you against the ravages of SARS-CoV-2 and some of the long-term effects of that, the fact that we have at least 6 months of experience to me is rather reassuring, and balanced against the risks for not getting any protection against the virus. I think most people will probably weigh in and say that vaccination is the right choice for them. But again, this is the point of discussion with your own healthcare provider. Next slide. So then the last myth that I want to cover, and this relates a little bit to something I already touched on. So I took the COVID vaccine, but I tested negative for antibodies, and that meant that the vaccine didn't work for me. Well, again, we already touched on the fact that routine testing is not recommended, and I've already pointed out why. It's because that if you got tested for the wrong thing, meaning the wrong antibody profile, a negative test might actually be completely expected, because if that test was testing against whether you had had the virus itself, whether you'd had natural infection, then of course it's going to be negative if you've only been vaccinated. So on the other hand, if you had the right test measured at the right time, and it was completely negative, and there definitely are reports of that, and as long as you were tested in the right time frame, which in my opinion is at least 2 to 4 weeks after the second or the final dose of your vaccine series, if you had the right test in that right time frame and it was truly negative, then yeah, I think that would be some cause for concern. That's a whole lot of ifs, but sure, does that occur? And have I seen that occur? Yes, I've heard a handful of people that have sort of shared with me anecdotally their own results We have no idea how often that happens. I personally suspect that it's uncommon, but I think for certain therapies, that may well be. And I suspect that the more immunocompromised that somebody is and the more treatments that they're on, particularly certain kinds of treatments, maybe rituximab and some of the lupus treatments may have more of a profound effect. Probably the most immunocompromising medicine amongst any I've named are high-dose steroids. So if somebody's on, say, prednisone of 60 milligrams a day, that really makes it hard for the immune system to build an antibody response and build up the maximal protection after a vaccine that it needs. So again, if you've been tested, then this is something to talk with your healthcare provider about whether you had the right test in the right time frame. Even if there was concern, what would you do about it? Well, what could make sense is you just repeat the series or get a booster vaccine. But there's been many, many millions of people that haven't even gotten their first dose or their first series, that it's probably premature to start talking about the need for a booster or repeating the series. So this one, I'm sure, will be an evolution, but there was a whole lot of ifs that would need to be met. And for many people, they may be unduly alarmed if their antibody testing was against the wrong component of the virus, particularly if it wasn't the component that's in the vaccine. Next slide. And then the last thing that I want to make mention, and I know Shilpa is going to speak to this in just a couple minutes when we wrap up, there are a number of different support programs from the Global Healthy Living Foundation that are tied to the Arthritis Power Registry and that are tied to the Creaky Joints patient community, and she can speak to that. We've got maybe about 9 more minutes, and I wanted to do that to address some of the pre-questions that many, many people were very helpful and gracious to submit that hopefully will benefit others. I'm going to walk through a handful of these, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time. There were many that we're not going to get to, but I've tried to pick out the ones that I thought might have the most universal interest. So to run through just a few quickly. For the 2-dose vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna, should both doses be of the same vaccine or can they differ? That's an easy one. They both should be of the same vaccine. If you got Pfizer for the first dose, you should get Pfizer for the second. The spacing of that is pretty well defined. So it's 3 weeks between the 2 Pfizer and 4 between the Moderna doses. If something happened, let's say that you got COVID between the 2 doses, should you just go ahead and get the second dose? No, you should not. You should wait until you're better. If there was a delay, let's say, I don't know, it was 2 or 3 months, not 3 or 4 weeks. Do you have to start over again? No, you don't. You should just go get the second dose as soon as you can. Is one vaccine better than another? I think no. I've already spoken to that already. The best vaccine is the one that you have access to. There's been a lot of questions that are of the variant of, will we need to do this every year? Do we need to get a booster? That sort of thing. How long will immunity last? How long will my protection last, etc.? The short version is nobody really knows. So I think it's very possible that immunity to this, even for the general population, will not be lifelong, that this is something that we might need to do with some periodicity. We just don't know that, but that's currently in process to sort that out. A few others that may affect women. Is the vaccine safe for women who are breastfeeding? And I'd also point out the extension. Is it safe for women who might be pregnant? Yes. And in fact, the CDC specifically addresses that. Those women should, in fact, get vaccinated. Couple others. Can I still get COVID despite being vaccinated? Well, yes. Nothing in life is 100%. So even if a vaccine was 95% effective, that still means that, there will be a few cases of COVID, even in somebody who got excellent protection from the vaccine. Just to give you a sense, 95% or 70, 80, 90%, even if it might be as low as that, that is as good, if not better, than flu vaccine, pneumonia vaccine, shingles vaccine. Like, this is as good and as effective to protect against COVID as pretty much any vaccine that we have in the United States for anything. But there still will be some cases. Now, it may be that they're less severe cases if they occur in people who got vaccinated. It's also very possible that there might be asymptomatic shedding that's reduced if you got vaccinated, meaning that maybe you're less likely to be a carrier and transmit it to others. So in fact, one of the statements that we didn't talk much about is that family members of immune-compromised patients should get vaccinated so that they lessen the likelihood to transmit to their family members or close household contacts. So that's another principle about why it might make sense for close contacts of at-risk people to be vaccinated. And another one, is it safe to take over-the-counter medications like pain relievers, Tylenol, acetaminophen, fever reducers, NSAIDs, ibuprofen, Celebrex, things like that? And so for all of that reason, those medicines we don't have any evidence for. The recommendation, however, is that you don't routinely use that if you're not already on them at the time that you're getting ready to get vaccinated. So sometimes people had the idea, wait, maybe I might get a fever, and in order to avert that possibility, I'm just going to prophylactically or as a preventive thing take some Tylenol or some ibuprofen or some Aleve. I probably wouldn't do that. We don't have data about it. It's certainly not going to be a safety issue. The timing for all the medicines, those and everything else we've been talking about, are almost certainly an issue of maybe the vaccine might not work quite as well, just because anything that reduces the inflammatory response, like ibuprofen, Tylenol, even in a small way, it's that inflammatory response that's actually your immune system kind of revving up the machinery to fight off the infection. That's the whole point of a vaccine, is to rev up your immune system briefly to fight off an infection were it to see it, and you don't want to tamp that down even with something that might seem as small as Tylenol or ibuprofen. And then some of the long-term effects about disease flares, how long might I be expected with my condition to be protected after the vaccine? So all of those things we honestly just don't know much about. In fact, the Arthritis Power Registry, which is the research registry, and it's the research arm of Creaky Joints, I would very much appreciate and encourage people to join Arthritis Power. We expect and hope that in the next 4 to 6 to 8 weeks time frame, we will be launching a study to go better understand patients' experience with the vaccine, side effects or symptoms that they might experience after vaccination, and then ultimately effectiveness against COVID. That'll be done in the context of the Arthritis Power Research Registry. So I would encourage you to check that out if that's something that you might be willing to help participate in and to lend your experience to the benefit of other patients like you. And I'm very thankful that Arthritis Power both was created and spearheads important patient-centered research like that. And that'll be a study that we'll be launching quite soon to help gain the evidence that we need for some of these critically important topics. So with that, I think we're getting relatively close to the end of our time, and I realize that there may have been a lot of burning questions that may not have been asked or answered, again, for which I apologize, but Creaky Joints and Global Healthy Living will have some FAQs or some responses to the many questions that we didn't have time to address. And Shilpa, I'll turn things back over to you so that you can talk about some of the other great resources that Creaky Joints and GHLF make available for patients.
Thank you so much, Dr. Curtis. I think everyone will agree that that was very, very informative. So thank you for all that information. Just to reiterate, if anyone is interested in learning about new opportunities or participating in the study that Dr. Curtis mentioned, you might consider joining Arthritis Power at www.arthritispower.org. That is our research registry. We want to thank you, the audience, especially for your questions. As we said initially, we received an overwhelming number of questions, and there were, of course, questions that we weren't able to get to today, and we apologize for that. What we will do is we maintain a list of your questions, and they will help us to inform future content so we can continue to address your concerns. We'll find a way to respond to all your questions. So thank you for your patience with that. What you see on my screen are resources that we wanted to share with you. Many of you are already aware of these resources. We know that coronavirus, the pandemic, has been especially stressful for people with chronic diseases. And so we at Global Healthy Living Foundation have developed a free program for patients and their families to access updated information, community support, and other resources, including the latest information on vaccines, what the evidence is telling us about masking, how to manage your chronic disease during the pandemic, and so on. So that is our GHLF free COVID-19 patient support program and you can find more information at www.ghlf.org. We also have developed what's called the Creaky Joints COVID-19 vaccine information, which is a resource tailored specifically towards people who are immunocompromised. Again, we know it's difficult to follow all the news, the vaccine news that's relentlessly sort of coming out every day, especially if you're someone living with an immune-compromised condition or if you're immune-compromised for any other reason. And this is our way to help you navigate the latest and most up-to-date information on COVID-19 vaccines. So again, please consider joining these programs. Last word is that this webinar will be recorded. So in about 7 to 10 days, you should see it posted up on our Creaky Joints website, and we'll send you notifications as it becomes available on the website as well. With that, thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Curtis, for your time, and thank you to our audience for joining us and for your questions today. Have a good rest of your day.